Let me just begin by saying good evening and thank you to everyone for joining us here for the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education's annual Constitution Day event, the Tom E. Moses Memorial Lecture on the U.S. Constitution. My name is Jay Wyatt. I am the director of the Byrd Center, and tonight's program marks the 16th Annual Moses Memorial Lecture. It also is the first digital Moses Memorial Lecture. And we, of course, wish that we could be with you in person, but despite that little mute issue that popped up there at the beginning, we are pretty well prepared to pivot to the digital format that we're going to follow this evening. And going digital has created the opportunity for far more people to join us for this event than we normally would have. So that's an unexpected silver lining in all of this. If this is your first Byrd Center event or your first Moses Memorial Lecture, I welcome you to our fantastic community. I thank the many of you who have already muted your mics, and we're going to ask that when we get started that you mute your cameras as well. We are recording tonight's program, and so that helps us prepare the video and ensure a quality capture. Following the talk, we invite you to submit questions via the chat box for the Q&A portion of the program. I will be moderating the Q&A, and my only requests are that you keep your questions relatively concise and on topic, and that you make sure that they are, in fact, questions. As we begin here, I want to first thank the Moses family for their ongoing support for this lecture series. In particular, I want to recognize the contributions and support of Mr. Moses' daughters, Lynn Moses Yellett, Merle Crawford, and Jerry Moses Eichler, as well as their husbands, Chess, Greg, and Len. Putting this program together has always been a collaborative endeavor, and this year was no exception. We at the Byrd Center are extremely proud of the ongoing success of this series, which has brought prominent scholars, policy experts, and a few U.S. senators to the campus at Shepherd University, where the Byrd Center lives, to discuss constitutional issues in both historical and contemporary contexts each September. We very much appreciate their ongoing support, and we certainly appreciate our ongoing and fruitful partnership with Shepherd University. This lecture series is named for the late Tom E. Moses, and with good reason. Mr. Moses was a decorated World War II veteran and a devoted civil libertarian who spent much of his life defending American civil liberties and the U.S. Constitution. As a young man, he worked on fair housing and civil rights issues in Cleveland and Baltimore. While living in Ohio, he started the first welfare rights organization in the United States. And later, as a longtime resident of Jefferson County, West Virginia, he founded the Eastern Panhandle branch of the American Civil Liberties Union, West Virginia. And for these efforts, among many others, Mr. Moses was recognized widely and frequently by local and state leaders, including Senators Robert C. Byrd and Jay Rockefeller. In addition to all that I just mentioned, Mr. Moses was also a longtime member of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, a nonpartisan educational and advocacy organization founded after World War II and dedicated to advancing separation of religion and government to ensure freedom of religion for all. Senator Byrd, who helped establish Constitution Day and was famous for carrying a small copy in his pocket, often referred to the Constitution as, quote, the strongest piece of armor protecting the rights and the freedoms of each and every citizen. Mr. Moses recognized this truth, and he recognized the many ways in which social justice issues, such as fair housing, welfare rights, civil rights, and religious rights for all overlap, intertwine, and intersect as constitutional issues. The fights for equality and social justice sit at the core of the American experience. The Constitution affords us the right to dissent and protest, and the opportunity to make ours a more perfect union. Of course, these fights have taken on renewed vigor in recent years, and this year in particular, they have been driven to the front of our collective consciousness. In communities small and large, Rural, urban, and suburban, millions of Americans have seized their constitutional rights and pushed back against the many forms of historic systemic racism, discrimination, and inequality in America. And these efforts have challenged police violence and violence against women. They have shed a much needed spotlight on the ways in which public health crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the opioid epidemic, and natural disasters like the wildfires that are engulfing the West Coast right now, and Hurricane Sandy in the South, disproportionately impact communities of color and poor communities. And in doing so, they have shown us in stark terms that social justice issues that impact some are constitutional issues that impact us all. They have reminded us of the power and the truth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous maxim that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And they have also reminded us of the importance of getting into what the late Congressman John R. Lewis called good trouble. I'm sure that most of you are aware that Congressman Lewis passed earlier this summer from pancreatic cancer. And in his passing, the United States lost a hero of the Black freedom movement, a lion of Congress, and a transcendent activist for equality and justice, who, despite a life dedicated to the ongoing struggle, never lost faith in the power of the people to transform this nation into what he called the beloved community. And in an essay that ran in the New York Times on the day of his funeral, Congressman Lewis reminded us that, quote, democracy is not a state, it is an act. And that participation in the democratic process through voting and nonviolent activism and protest offer the clearest path toward laying down what he defined as the heavy burdens of hate. Like the namesake of this lecture series, John Lewis devoted his life to uplifting those who have been victimized by discrimination and hatred and unjust policies. And it's in recognition of these efforts that we very proudly dedicate the 2020 Tom E. Moses Memorial Lecture to the Honorable John R. Lewis. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's featured speaker works at the forefront of the fight for justice and equality in America. Dr. Sabrina Dent is the Senior Faith Advisor for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. She is a lifelong advocate for human rights and social justice. Throughout her career, Sabrina has worked with vulnerable populations, including women and children impacted by domestic violence and abuse, youth with mental health and behavioral challenges, and racial and religious minorities. Her passion for religious freedom was kindled in 2015 when she became a fellow with the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. In between her time at BJC and her work for Americans United, Sabrina managed education initiatives for religious and civic leaders as the Director for Recruitment and Admissions at the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum. In this capacity, Sabrina led a 3-year program titled Religious Freedom, African American Perspectives. And she is also the past president of the Interfaith Community of Greater Richmond. Sabrina holds Masters of Divinity and a Doctor of Ministry degree from the School of Theology at Virginia University. She has presented and participated in numerous scholarly programs and events, including the American Academy of Religion's Public Scholars Project, the Faith Journeys in the Black Experience 1619 to 2019 commemoration, and the 2018 World's Religions Conference. In 2019, she moderated a discussion, Voices of a New Generation, Racial and Religious Reconciliation, at the BYU Law School's Religious Freedom Conference. And earlier this year, Sabrina delivered the keynote address at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor's Micah Institute at the Clergy and Lay Leaders Conference. She has written extensively on the intersection of race and religious freedom. One of her most recent articles, titled The Two Big G's, God and Government, emphasizes the importance of separation of church and state even in difficult times. And in that, the essay is certainly timely. The title of Sabrina's talk tonight this evening is The Morality of Freedom, Reimagining the Promises of the U.S. Constitution. And if we were at the Byrd Center, I would normally ask you all to help me welcome Sabrina with a nice round of applause right now. but since I just asked you all to mute your microphones, that's not an option. So you can offer some welcoming comments in the chat box if you like, and I will just conclude these opening remarks by simply saying that we are incredibly excited and privileged to host Dr. Sabrina Dent as this year's Tom E. Moses Memorial Lecturer. Take it away, Sabrina.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jay. I appreciate that warm welcome and introduction. And I'm so grateful to be here this evening with all of you. As I move forward in this program, the first thing I want to do is I just want to share one slide, and I'll give more formal remarks in a moment, but this will lead to you having a better understanding of where the conversation will go this evening. So just give me one moment and I'll share my screen with you so you can see the slide. So this here is a slide that shows from slavery to religious freedom. If you see, there are several images that I have here. I have the door of no return at the Elmina Castle in Ghana. There's also the image of the Moorish Science Convention in 1928. As well as there is the flag, the LGBTQ flag that affirms the rights of LGBTQ individuals as far as the Equality Act and other legislation that has come forward. And then you see an image of U.S. Representative Ilhan Omar. So I want you to keep these images in your head as we move forward in tonight's presentation. And so with that, I would like to really give my official, thank yous and in response to Jay's warm welcome. So let me see, make sure I stop sharing my screen. Okay, so good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. James Wyatt, the director of the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education, for graciously extending the invitation to speak tonight. I would like to also thank the Moses family and Shepherd University. Without your support, this event would not be possible. And I also want to say thank you to my colleagues and friends. And I saw my mom was on. So to my mom who decided to join us tonight for this discussion. Now, I will be quite honest and say that I was initially surprised by the invitation to speak this evening. I knew just a little about the history of Senator Robert Byrd, but there was more that I needed to know about the ask of this particular event tonight. I recognize that many of you on the call, Constitution Day is not just another day, it's a sacred day for some of you. And so I wanted to hold that in high regard. And so, Jay, it was because of our very genuine and engaging conversation that affirmed that this was the right moment and the opportunity for me to share. The intentional ways in which you were seeking to promote a better understanding of the United States Congress and Constitution through programs and research that engage citizens of diverse backgrounds and perspectives is to be commended. Therefore, I am again incredibly grateful to share my research and my thoughts as a Black woman who thinks critically in intersectional ways about freedom, liberation, and our moral obligations, despite the very violent and complicated history for many people in America. At the same time, as a descendant of Napoleon Dent, my great-great-great-grandfather, who was born enslaved in Reduco, North Carolina in 1845, but was emancipated on April 4th, 1865, I do not take this moment lightly, remembering that I stand on the shoulders of courageous and resilient ancestors, both women and men. So thank you. As Director Wyatt has already mentioned, tonight's program honors the memory and the legacy of Congressman John Lewis, who dedicated his life to champion the civil and human rights of African Americans, as well as other marginalized groups in society. He was unapologetic about taking action and getting into good trouble. On January 17th, 2017, I remember sitting in awe in the Annenberg Theater at the museum as I watched him tell his story alongside his March co-author, Andrew Aiden. March was their best-selling and award-winning trilogy about Lewis's civil rights journey. I was intrigued by his humor, his storytelling, and most of all, his character. He told stories about his childhood in Alabama that were a part of his foundation as a youth and reflected on the events of Bloody Sunday, which was March 7th, 1965. That is when he led over 600 citizens, activists, religious and non-religious leaders across the Edmund Pettus Bridge from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. This was a concerted effort by many for Blacks in Alabama to gain the right to vote without discrimination or threats of death. And yet it is interesting to me that Lewis, Diane Nash, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and so many others had to cross a bridge named after a racist to gain access to their full rights to be citizen. So let's put this in context. That was only 55 years ago. So when Congressman John Lewis passed away on July 17th, I remember experiencing a deep sadness because I would now have to tell my 12-year-old son that one of his American heroes died on his birthday. The beautiful thing, though, is that John Lewis's legacy lives on, and I believe that each one of us has a responsibility to carry some part of that mantle. That is one that embodies moral imagination, ethics, and compassion. That is, if we choose to pay attention, to listen, and do the necessary work for the betterment of all people. In his final essay to us, Lewis penned that together we could redeem the soul of the nation. And I would dare say that there's a lot of redemption that needs to happen. Yet he also wrote that King said that it is not enough that we will get better by and by. He said it's up to each of us that has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something is not right, you must say something. You must do something. He said, democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what is called the beloved community, a nation and a world society at peace with itself. So tonight, I plan to continue to do my part by sharing reflections and insights using the subject, the morality of freedom, reimagining the promises of the US Constitution. Now, this topic is one that I've thought about deeply over the last 5 years. At the same time, is one that I continue to wrestle with as I navigate advocacy spaces and conversations about civil and human rights for various groups in America. There have been many times when I've been told that certain topics were off limits because of different stakeholders or coalition partners in an effort to keep the peace. However, I struggle with that ideology in practice, and here's why. On this day, 233 years ago, 41 of 55 state delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention to conclude the process of writing the initial blueprint for America's system of governing. Some were young and others were very seasoned in life. Specifically, Ben Franklin, it was noted he was 81 years old. They came from different backgrounds, had different levels of education. And in their minds, they actually came from different countries. See, each state to them seemed to be its own independent country. To that state, they pledged their allegiance. And they boldly took issue with the idea of being united. Some were wealthy, like George Washington, and others, like Alexander Hamilton, came from more humble beginnings. But All were white men who secretly in closed quarters discussed agendas and ideas that would shape a divided nation. This moment in history gave birth to the US Constitution that would become the written supreme law of the land. The three main issues that would be addressed were how the president would be elected, which focused on the Electoral College, the slave trade, which focused on human freedom, and the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, which includes the freedom of religion. These were all controversial issues that led to very heated debates in 1787. Consequently, they continue to have major implications in our country today. Yes, 233 years later. So keep in mind, a constitution is a document that determines how and who will govern the country. It sets the foundation and the structure for an entity's operations. And in this case, in 1787, there were no women nor people of color present. So how is freedom really understood by a dedicated group of individuals, as I stated earlier, white, mostly slave-owning men, whose intentions were to establish a new constitution and a new society by protecting their own interests and property? Is it really possible for freedom and liberation to really fully be extended to all when from the country's inception there was exclusion? This is not just a question of establishment, but it's one of morality and justice. In 1991, the now late Thomas E. McCullough wrote the book, The Moral Imagination and Public Life, Raising the Ethical Question. The author presents an argument that challenges the ethics of public policy while raising questions about the value systems that are sometimes implemented by politicians, leaders, economists, and individuals that impact how communities are often mishandled. He asserts that the textbook ethics are seldom practiced in boiler room situations. Throughout the book, he posed questions about making tough decisions that affects one's personal integrity. One that struck me in particular was, in each situation, how does a person arrive at an intelligent, principled decision with personal integrity? This is where an understanding of morality is important. See, morality, as he describes it, is understood as a way of life. It involves both individual and communal aspects. McCullough suggests that it takes into account embedded practices, beliefs, attitudes, and ways of being in the world. It is beyond one's responsibility to oneself, but to a community and a larger set of ideas that benefit the greater good of all of humanity. Yet many of the founding framers who proclaimed liberty and justice for all reserved that idea for only a dedicated group of individuals who could participate in government. That is, free, adult, white men who owned property or paid taxes. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Washington, specifically on these issues of slavery, chose to only see enslaved persons as property, but not people, when it was convenient for them. These individuals, along with other delegates, brilliantly crafted a document that provided a perceived solid foundation for democracy for centuries to come. Yet they struggled with emancipating their slaves who by their divine birthright deserved human freedom. McCullough's book about moral imagination serves as a reminder that ethical reflection is necessary in the public square. And yet we continue to be plagued by a history that is doomed to repeat itself if corrective actions are not addressed and taken in 2020. Now, whereas the previous name founders frequently receive praise as American heroes, I want to talk about an often forgotten and controversial delegate from New York, Governor Morris. Now, if you know anything about Governor Morris, then, and that is his first name, Governor, if you know anything about Morris, his public and private life were quite controversial, similar to a public figure in modern times. He's actually labeled in history as one of the wildest delegates that there were. And I would even say, and to some extent, womanizing. But that is actually for a later discussion. But in doing my research, I actually learned that Morris is penned in history as the writer of the preamble to the Constitution. One of the most fascinating resources that I engaged doing my research was the fault lines in the Constitution written by Cynthia and Sanford Levinson. In the book, they highlighted how Morris created the preamble out of several other state constitutions, because he thought it was important for the delegates to adopt a more unified understanding and practice of government. And additionally, Morris was one of the more verbal delegates at the convention who publicly spoke out against the horrors of institutionalized slavery and condemned his fellow delegates. Now, although many of them were convinced about the evils of slavery, the notion of freeing another person's property was appalling. For them, property was currency. Morris thought that it was a contradiction for enslaved people to be considered property. And he stated, upon what principle is it that slaves be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then are no other property included? He said the houses in the city of Philadelphia are worth more than all the wretched slaves that cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. And he went on to say that the admission of slaves in the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this: that an inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages. And he proceeded to say that slavery was not only a horror, but nefarious as a practice. As a man, Morris was far from perfect. At the same time, I raise him up because he recognized his moral obligation as an elected leader to address what he saw as a horrible blemish in this country. Now, by now, you're probably thinking, okay, Constitution Day is about more than slavery. And to that, I respond, I agree. Tonight's topic is about the morality of freedom and reimagining the promises of the US Constitution. So we cannot discuss the promises without looking at the fragmented founders who were like us, human beings who have free will and the power to choose. Let's think for a moment. What would our country look like today if the other 54 delegates considered the words of Governor Morris and denounced the slave trade in 1787? What would our country be today if women, racial and religious minorities were active participants in the Philadelphia Convention? I'm not certain, but I would guess that it would probably be a better place. None of us can deny that 2020 has been filled with many challenges and significant milestones and critical moments in history. In March, the entire world would cease operations and life as we knew it in efforts to control a deadly and unpredictable coronavirus known as COVID-19 that would drastically change the world. Families, communities, cities would face financial hardships, and even religious communities, while corporations, endowed organizations, private and religious schools would apply for stimulus relief. Meanwhile, service workers and grocery store employees struggled to make decisions about facing the possibility of death, going to work for pennies, or staying home to be safe while becoming penniless. Their status in society moved up to essential, whereas their livable wages in most cases remained the same. Yet the United States Senate would spend time debating whether or not Americans deserved to receive a one-time payment of $1,200 during this moment of crisis. A crisis we did not choose, but was imposed on us by something bigger than all of us: science. We would witness the tragic and sudden loss of almost 200,000 people to a virus that disproportionately impacted Black people and people in poor communities. And I actually knew 3 of them. Many public school districts would scramble to provide the technological resources and the tools for students to engage in online learning, not to mention navigate how to provide meals to students who receive free or reduced lunches. And in many cases, that meal would be their only meal, depending on their family circumstances. Yet, a financial analysis conducted by Americans United for Separation of Church and State in July of 2020 would reveal that the Payroll Protection Program would allocate billions, between $2.67 billion and $6.47 billion of taxpayer dollars towards thousands of private religious schools, which is a violation of the Constitution and the separation of religion and government. Since April 2020, communities and organizations have pushed Be Counted campaigns for households to self-report demographics with the intentions of securing government funding for their public school districts and their city budgets. Because in some cities like my hometown, every dollar matters. And practices of gerrymandering and gentrification have implications that, like slavery, separates families from their communities of origin. This is also an election year, and we're in the thick of it right now. Over the last several weeks, we have witnessed political parties publicly making promises, appealing to the masses about sensitive topics such as the economy, healthcare, women's reproductive rights, gun control, climate change, and foreign affairs, amongst the host of other important issues. Both candidates have used their platform to appeal to targeted racial, ethnic, minority audiences who are disproportionately impacted by criminal justice reform, racial justice, immigration, education, voter suppression, and income inequalities. At the same time, both have appealed to religious groups to affirm their deeply held convictions. Although Article 6 of the US Constitution clearly outlines that there is no religious test for office, candidates are only bound to uphold the Constitution. Yet in the court of public opinion, there continues to be this moral dilemma of who has the right to be in America and how people should believe. Last year, the Public Religion Research Institute actually conducted a survey asking people how many believed that small business owners had the right to discriminate against people based on their identities in certain groups. And so 15% believed that they could discriminate against African Americans because of their deeply held religious beliefs. That percentage was a little higher for Jewish people as well as Muslims, and much higher for gay, transgender, and transgender communities. So to reimagine the promises of the Constitution, we must remember that every person has a right to the freedom of religion. That is to practice their religious beliefs or to not profess one at all, according to their conscience. Religion and religious freedom should never be a weapon used to cause harm to others or to discriminate. However, again, in 2020, we continue to see proposed pieces of legislation, such as the HUD anti-trans shelter proposed rule, pushed to discriminate against members of the LGBTQ community. And I would also add, it also discriminates against women, because the guidelines then suggest that if a woman or a person looks a certain way or has facial hair or is a certain height, then they could be turned away based on what one perceives them to be. During the pandemic, no one should ever be turned away by a government-funded program, which is your taxpayer dollars, because of who they are, who they appear to be, or because of someone else's religious beliefs. The separation of religion and government, as outlined in the First Amendment of the Constitution, is written in these words that say, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or press, or the right for people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for grievances." The government should not show favoritism or preference towards religious groups, and that people of religions and none must be treated fairly. However, I found it very interesting this summer when the president decided to tear gas peaceful protesters and then take a Bible and stand in front of the St. John's Church to make a public declaration after he had declared himself the president of law and order. Now, I'm not trying to be political in this moment, but I'm just stating the facts as we think about the implications of religious freedom and religious preference in this country. The United States, the Constitution is the highest law of the land. And that's what these words in the First Amendment remind me of, that there is no place for Christian nationalism in a country that was never founded on Christian principles. And never should one's identity as an American be tied to the notion that they should identify as a Christian. As we approach November 2020, we must continue to hold our elected officials accountable for the moral obligation to serve we the people. That looks different in 2020 than it did in 1787. It has been documented by different organizations such as the Public Religion Research Institute, as well as Pew, that the religious landscape in America is changing. There is an increase of religious nuns in this country. So the demographics are shifting. And this country is comprised of religious and non-religious people from beautiful and diverse racial and cultural and ethnic backgrounds, who identify from many different genders and by many different pronouns. Some of our families were brought here to the Americas in chains. Other families arrived by choice. And even some came out of desperation, seeking asylum from some of the worst circumstances in their home countries. We today, the demographics look different. We the people is comprised of 165.9 million strong women with voter rights guaranteed by the 19th Amendment. Unlike 1787, we the people are represented in many ways in the Supreme Court, in the Senate, and in the Congress. And we have the right to make choices about our health care, our bodies, and our reproductive rights. So why does all this matter on Constitution Day? It matters because a leader in the 21st century does not require that you are perfect, but willing to take risks to ensure that freedom and human dignity for every person is protected. And this is how we need to address the moral imperative of freedom in America. I want to take a moment and share my screen again to show you another slide, because there are a couple of facts that we need to consider as we move forward in our discussion. So here we have a slide that shows a timeline of events in history. And I think it's important because when we're talking about the Constitution and being reminded that everyone matters, everyone should be heard and valued, it's important to see how, if we look back in the timeline of what I talked about earlier in terms of the founding of this country. So we have to look back at 1787 and be reminded that during the founding of this country, the founding framers did not fight for human freedom. And so when you have that time, when you have that as the foundation for your country, it makes it quite complicated to move forward when you have a set of ideas only for a set of dedicated people. One of the things that we have to remember is that in 1790, it was the Naturalization Act that legalized citizenship in America. And what that meant is what I talked about earlier was to be white, male, property owning, tax paying person, which again excluded women, it excluded Blacks, and it excluded Indigenous people. And then thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation, which started early in its drafting, but was passed in 1865 along with the 13th Amendment, we have to remember that it was almost 100 years before this change happened to really emancipate enslaved people. But we also need to consider that in 1909, and this is something that we have to pay attention to in US history, is how the rules and the guidelines often change based on who's involved in the circumstances. So in 1909, it was determined that Asiatic Turks could be considered white in America. Now, if you ever get an opportunity and you look at the demographics for the census, it has it so, and I'm specifically focusing on Africa in this, but North Africa, those individuals that come from North Africa can self-identify as white, whereas other parts of Africa, they're identified as Black. But here in this particular case in 1909, Mr. Najor, who's pictured here, fit the description of what it meant to be white in America. In 1922, there was a case with Takawa Ozawa, who was a Japanese man who was seeking citizenship in the United States. And his case went before the court, and it was said that what it meant to be white in America was defined by the common man. But this had already been determined by the law to say what it meant to be white in America. And so I raised this because we have to pay attention to the different nuances that takes place every time there's a different court case or a situation that comes up in our history, and think about who's impacted by these decisions. And then, of course, there was the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which would come, again, over 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and after the 13th Amendment. This timeline is a very short timeline because there are lots of other moments in history, and we do recognize that Blacks had voting rights earlier on. There is the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote, but we also know that during the Reconstruction era that there were practices in place such as polling taxes and other tests that would challenge the right for Blacks to freely vote, which is why we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So when you think about these nuanced situations that happen in history, we have to again think about the morality of our leaders in this nation and the country. We have to think about our moral obligation and responsibility to speak up, and as Congressman John Lewis often told us, to get into good trouble. But give me one second, I'm switching back to my screen. So again, I say, why does this all matter? It matters because we must address the moral imperative of freedom in America. We cannot unsee the cries for humanity that happened around the world in the wake of the tragic deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and even Dominic Femi Fells, who is a Black trans woman, and so many other people that we could name through public proclamations that happened as people said, Black Lives Matter. It's important that we take an inclusive approach and recognize who all the vested stakeholders are in our pledge and commitment to addressing systemic change in policies and political systems in the United States. So as I come to almost a close, I want to share these remarks. Again, why does all this matter? It matters because this lecture was an invitation for us all to interrogate the ways in which religion and religious freedom have been weaponized across time, laws, disciplines, and public policies. The examples that are shared invite us to reimagine conversations about innocent children who are victims of racially motivated terrorism that impacts their liberation, existence, survival, and religious identities as racial and religious minorities. Just this week, we remembered the 4 girls that were killed in the 16th Street bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. That was a racially motivated act of religious terrorism. We have to remember that no matter if a child is separated from their family in a courtroom or at the border, that their lives matter, their rights matter, their dignity matters. And if we believe that religious freedom is a constitutional and human right for people of all religions and none, then we must take the necessary action steps to address any administration that uses religious freedom to discriminate against Muslim majority in African countries in the form of travel bans, or by promoting policies that give exemptions to medical providers on the basis of religious exemptions, which causes harm to women and members of the LGBTQIA community. I hope that during this time that you reflected on your role, the role that you play in educating your community about the significance of protecting religious freedom for all while creating a space to walk with others who experience any type of discrimination and take the action steps to become an engaged person in the discourse. I'm often reminded, and I love to quote Angela Davis from her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. It's a great resource to read if you have not read one. And there are a couple of others that I could recommend as well. But Angela Davis in her book reminds us that this is not a matter of it being your issue or my issue, but it is our issue. It is our issue to address as citizens who hold individuals and communities in care. If we are serious about following the wisdom of Congressman John Lewis by redeeming the soul or the conscience of this nation, then we must be willing to do the difficult and sometimes thankless work to evoke systemic change in public attitudes and policies. Most importantly, we must be proactive about petitioning our elected leaders about the issues that matter most to us. If we believe that religious freedom is a constitutional and human right for all, then we must make every effort to educate ourselves about the issues, engage in dialogue with another to seek their understanding about their perspective and their experiences, and then we must take action. And I think I want to add there that it's important for us to engage in dialogue. That's one of the healthiest ways in which we can understand another person's experiences or what brought them to believe what they believe. I often like the work of Dr. Walter Fluker, who is now retired from Boston University. He did a lot of work in ethical leadership. And he often asked the question, like, who are the characters in the plot of your narrative that influenced your life, that shaped your thoughts and your opinions about certain things? So I say to that we must make every effort to educate ourselves, engage in dialogue with one another, and seek understanding about perspectives. and taken action. But overall, it's the responsibility of religious and non-religious leaders, free thinkers of a moral conscience, as well, to be intentional about the efforts to include all voices in this discussion about religious freedom. We must learn to be compassionate listeners who are willing to take risks to advocate for those who are challenged by privilege and sit on the margins of life. We must collaborate with those who are doing the work. America's United is one of those places that is doing the work, and I'm proud to work for Americans United. With that, I want to share this one final story. This past week, Americans United hosted its first National Advocacy Summit, where we had pre-recorded and live sessions where people had the opportunity to hear from many different experts about religious freedom and church-state issues, and why it's important to keep religion and government separated, why people shouldn't take, or religious houses of worship shouldn't take taxpayer money to advance their cause. But it was on Tuesday that we had a National Day of Action, where we participated in virtual lobby visits with our congressional representatives and our senators' offices to discuss an important piece of legislation. I decided as a staff person that I wanted to participate as a constituent, because it's one thing to do this in my daily life as a part of my job. It's a whole nother thing when I make a concerted effort and commitment to do the work on behalf of humanity, because it is the right and moral thing to do. So we actually introduced the Do No Harm Act, a piece of legislation that really focuses on to make sure that RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, is not being used to discriminate or cause harm to others. And this happens in many different ways. It happens in employment practices, whether it's firing, hiring, or promotions. It also happens in determining who has access to health care. There are a lot of employers that block access to birth control for employees as well as for students. And a lot of times people misunderstand that birth control is not always about contraception. Sometimes it's about helping for medical conditions. And I know I personally have my own story to that. But I went to one congressional office and we spoke with the aide, and it was a great conversation. And toward the end of the visit, we made the ask of the aide to talk to our representative and asked if they would co-sponsor the bill that was presented by Senator Kamala Harris for the Do No Harm Act. And again, this is not about partisan politics. This is about human dignity and humanity and people's lives that are at stake and that are at risk. And the aide responded that the senator was in support of it and was aware of it. And she finalized her remarks by saying, if the bill was already on the floor, then they would have already voted for it. I was a little puzzled by her remarks, because for me, moral leadership requires that we take proactive leadership that embodies the care and compassion of everyone. That's the idea behind moral imagination. The morality of freedom is about considering the concerns of humanity, not just one individual, but for all. And I know that gets complicated in some cases, and that's something that we could talk about at another time. But I recognize that centuries of poor decisions in the best interest of the 1% had left blood on the hands and the streets for the 99%. We are at a critical point in history where a change has to happen. And so with that, I'm borrowing from the words of Angela Davis when she gave a speech at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, Turkey in 2015. She said, we have to do something extraordinary. We have to go to great lengths. We cannot go on as usual. We cannot pivot the center, and we cannot be moderate. We will have to be willing to stand up and say no with our combined spirits and our collective intellects, and with our many bodies. Tonight, I invite you to be a part of that movement. I invite you to be the moral conscience and thought leader that's needed in your community to help advance the concerns of everyone. As I stated earlier, we look different. We, the people, look different than it did in 1787. But we, the people that are here now, matter more than anything else. We, the people, includes people who are immigrants, that are seeking asylum, people that have religious beliefs and those who do not, people who are just simply seeking to be themselves by loving someone because they love them. And it's also those children who are also in foster care systems that are awaiting loving homes that are being denied because of some government funded programs where people believe that a person doesn't have the right religious belief or identity. Again, I invite you to reflect on the role of being a person of moral conscience and remembering that the Constitution protects all of us, that we all have a right to freedom of belief and conscience, but we all have a right to exist in the fullness of our humanity. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Thank you very much. If we were in person, I'm sure you would have a hearty round of applause, and we're not, but please accept our deep appreciation for your wonderful talk. And everyone, please feel free to contribute questions. And there is sometimes a bit of a lag with the chat box, but please do contribute them. And I will maybe get us started. And you know, your last kind of passage there, really about sort of leadership and moral leadership, and you know, it's something ethical leadership is, you know, I think something that, you know, many of us are thinking about. It seems to me that there's also there needs to be creativity in all of this, right? We really need to think about these things differently and sort of view these issues through different lenses and be open to other interpretations. Are there places, organizations, entities that you see doing this work right now, outside of your own,
Yeah.
that is really kind of engaging in this kind of creativity in terms of sort of rethinking all of this? Because you use the word imagination a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what it takes.
Yes, that's a really great question, Jay. There are organizations that are doing this work outside of Americans United, and we're actually in coalition with some organizations that are doing so. I'll use this as an example. I talked about earlier in my presentation, or it was later actually, the HUD anti-trans shelter proposed rule. One of the things is that we collaborated with many different organizations to address this issue. And I think it's important that you talked about imagination and being creative, is that anytime you're engaged in any type of coalition work or interfaith work on issues, that yes, you need to have many different perspectives. As I shared with some students or some fellows recently that are coming through our program, you cannot address issues about a particular community and not have the voice of that community present. So it is important that if we're talking about like religious freedom, that we're engaging people from many different spaces. So I know like the Hindu American Foundation is an organization that is doing collaboration work with other organizations. The Institute for Social Policy and Concern, Social Policy and Understanding, excuse me, have also collaborated on efforts to address like the perceptions of Christian perceptions on American Muslims. Like there are many different ways in which there's collaboration that takes place. Also, one of the groups that I've recently become engaged with is the Washington Interfaith Staff Community. And so there are lots of different issues that we collaborate on. And again, it brings in the many different perspectives because there may be an issue that comes up, but presenting a new viewpoint about it and centering someone else in the conversation then widens our understanding and broadens our understanding for the work that can be done and what needs to be done to change attitudes and policies.
Yeah, I agree. So Barb has contributed a question, and I actually think there's kind of two questions there. So I'm gonna maybe ask this in two separate ways. The first question is, what is the simple way that we can help?
Mm-hmm.
How do you engage?
Right. So one of the ways, of course, because I work for Americans United, I'm gonna say, visit Americans United page to learn more about the work that we're doing. But a simple way is to engage on issues and really trying to seek understanding is to use the resources that are in place. I say data is important. I mentioned the PRI, Public Religion Research Institute. Look at some of the information that they have posted on their website and some of the data that is helping to shape people's opinions about different things that are happening in society. At the same time, ways that you can help is, I can only point you back to Americans United because of some of the work that we're doing. Now, there are other organizations that I'm in coalition with. So, for example, I mentioned Christian nationalism. For those that may identify as Christians, there is a Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign that is happening where Christians, I would say this, it was addressed by non-Christian individuals that said to Christians, you need to do something about what is happening right now, right? You need to say something. It couldn't be those communities. It had to come from the Christian community. And one of the things is that the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, or they just go by BJC now, is leading that campaign where they're asking people to take a pledge, but also to deepen their understanding and think about history through a different lens. History has always been told in many cases by a certain lens. But when you tell the story, and that's through some of the work that I've done through the Religious Freedom Center, when you tell the narratives from those that are on the margins of society, then you get a whole different story. And so it's important to look at those issues. So those are some of the ways that you can learn more and become engaged.
So the second question, the second part of Barb's question sort of referred to, I think, what is a pretty broad feeling that a lot of people have in this year in particular, but, you know, teaching college kids who sort of hear this a lot too, about sort of feeling powerless to impact change. And so, you know, how do you as an activist, you know, sort of help people sort of through that? And do you have any kind of tools in your toolkit that sort of you go to when, you know, I would love to think that I'm kind of like John Lewis and I never sort of lose that faith or hid into the dark corner of my mind, but, you know, you got to figure, but you do. So what are the tools that you have to kind of help you sort of maintain the positivity that you clearly exude?
Right, thank you. And that's a great question, Barb. The reality is that I think there are many times when many of us feel hopeless and helpless. Like I have experienced that myself. Like, and that's part of my humanness. I think, and that's important for us to acknowledge. Like, we're human beings. We can't be on 100 all the time. But some of the tools that have helped me in my interfaith engagement, one of the things that I did in my doctoral research is I focused on bridging the gap of race and interfaith relations and helping people to understand that there are just certain basics that need to be understood, and that's human dignity, right? No matter what your religious beliefs are or not, right? If you cannot value another human being, then there are larger concerns that need to be addressed. But as far as your engagement and how you can impact change is by one conversation at a time. Right? Is having a conversation with someone that you know and that you don't know, and really asking questions. That's a big part of dialogue, is that you're engaged in a specific type of a discussion where you're seeking understanding through the person's words, through their experiences, and you're asking open-ended questions, and you come into it with a healthy sense of self. And I say healthy sense of self because a lot of times people say they want to get into dialogue with someone, but they want to enter into the dialogue with the intentions of changing the person's mind or trying to coerce them into something else. But the thing is, in dialogue, what you're doing is you're listening for understanding. That's one of the ways that I've learned to do it, and that in my life, quite honestly, my lived experiences have taught me something differently than what my embedded theologies or the deliberative theologies that were placed on me earlier on showed me. So, for example, one of the things I did not share is that, I grew up Pentecostal. My dad was a Pentecostal preacher. I ended up in the Baptist church, and at some point in my life, I ended up doing Buddhist meditation with my child, and I also studied Scientology. It was through these many different experiences and my interfaith experience that I really had a deeper understanding of other people and their beliefs. And that helped me to be a better advocate for humanity. It was actually working in the DV shelter that really helped me get a stronger sense of that. So that was long before I even became a religious freedom advocate. It was looking at the human needs and concerns of a person that, for me, were more important in many cases than what they believed religiously, because I wanted to know at the end of the day, did they have a place to go? Did they have access to food? And those were the things that helped. On a policy level, I would say one of the things that you do is get engaged in opportunities to address your representative. I said we have to hold representatives accountable for the things that they do and that they say. Right now, a lot of promises are being made, and we have to make sure that they live up to the promises that they're making to communities. And I think that is important. I think when you see an issue, as one of the movies, because I have a school-age child, I love the movie Robots, and so so Big Weld would say, if you see a need, fill a need. Like, if you have the capacity to help and fill a need, then do that. But advocate on behalf of those that feel like they don't have a voice, that feel like they're not being heard. Become not just their ally. As one of my friends, Charles Watson says, he says, an ally is someone that can jump in and out of the fight. He said, whereas an accomplice is someone that's going to be there with you the whole time. And so that's what you want, is you want to become an accomplice for those issues and those concerns for humanity that align with yours. And I think that's one of the ways in which you can get engaged.
Yeah, that's great answer. Jody has asked, says, it seems that Americans United and partner organizations are bridging the gaps between various marginalized or targeted communities based around the larger shared struggle for freedom of conscience. Is this a recent construct, or has this approach to expanding the we the people been around longer?
That's a great question. Well, I've only been at Americans United since April, but I would say this: under the leadership of Rachel Lasser, I know there has been this strong commitment to making sure that underrepresented voices, marginalized communities are heard in these conversations. For any of you that have ever navigated religious freedom circles, and I'm not ashamed to say this or state this, is that that those spaces tend to be very white, and they tend to be very male, and they tend to be a lot older than my demographic. And so the reality of it is there are many other people that are impacted by freedom of conscience in America. And also think about this, non-religious people are not one type of people. There's a group that I partner with, Mandisa Thomas, who is the president of Black Non-Believers. She's doing incredible work. And a lot of times, there have been many times that I've called her into programs or conversations to be a part of it, because one of the things that is important is that when you see that there is representation missing from the table, and if you're at the table, you have a responsibility to invite those to the table that have a voice and have concerns that need to be addressed in that space. And so a lot of the work that I have been intentional about is making sure that we are including we the people, but AU has done a major effort, and AU has always championed for the religious freedom rights of all people, whether they had a religious identity or not, and also making sure that there is the separation of religion and government. So that's not necessarily a recent development, but I think AU is being more intentional about the messaging that is going out, whether it's on social media, whether it's in the blogs that we write, whether it's through the programs that we have. Because if we don't, there are communities that may look like mine that are not engaged in the conversation, but are impacted by it. So, and I can say much to that. Like, for example, when you're talking about reproductive rights or reproductive justice, that disproportionately impacts women of color. And so why not have women of color engaged in that discussion? So there's so many different ways in which that conversation is being expanded, but I don't think it's necessarily new. I think you just see a stronger push to make it more visible, especially in the height of everything that has happened in 2020. So kudos to Rachel and her leadership of the organization.
Yeah. So Chess and Lynn Moses Yellett have asked if, how you think the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights sort of works or can function as a model for additional rights that we in the US can aspire to.
That's a really great question. That was actually on one of my slides, but I took it out because I was like, we're talking about U.S. history. So, but that's so important. And I think it's also important to note that Eleanor Roosevelt was the only woman that was involved in that particular piece of the art, especially Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which affirms that people have the right to freedom of conscience and belief. They have the right to change their belief, whether it's in community or individually, and they have the right to do so without discrimination against them. And so, I think the UN Declaration of Human Rights is a very powerful document and piece of legislation that needs to be considered and talked about, right? Because it's one thing for us to have this conversation about religious freedom and human rights in a Western context, an American context. But when you think about globally, the impact on certain communities, so in certain places, Christians might be the religious minority, or in other areas, people that might profess their faith or their identity, or if they don't have a religious identity, are often killed and targeted for their beliefs. And I think that needs to be a part of the conversation. It needs to be a part of the discussion. It needs to be taught in schools. The challenge to it is that it's also a document that exists that we recognize that is not necessarily being enforced in every place. And we have to speak to that truth, that we know that people are still being killed because of their religious beliefs and being targeted, and people are doing worship underground. So people's, like the Falun Gong community, their organs are being harvested. So there are many atrocities that happen that are not necessarily experienced in the United States. So I think it is important that we talk about the UN Declaration, and it is a model for us to aspire to in the United States, but also around the world. So there's a lot of work that still needs to happen, a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's been interesting, I think, over the past year is kind of watching sort of the globalizing of what's been going on here, and for good and bad, but in terms of being hopeful about,
Right.
these opportunities to think about that. The UN Declaration is not a new document
No, not at
in
all.
the imagination. Uh, so,
Yes.
so, so Ray has asked, can religious freedom exist if government plays favorites with one religious group as its base?
No. No, no, it can't. It can't. That's the thing. Is like with the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause states that the government cannot show favoritism towards one religious group over another. It's not to play favorites, and I think that that's part of the work of Americans United, is that we call out those things when we see them happening. So true religious freedom allows for people to again practice according to their conscience and their beliefs without government interference and coercion or discrimination. And so there is there's still work in education that needs to happen. Like in the United States, we have to be real about, the document is in place, but it's only as good as those that enforce it and actually exercising, extending those rights to everyone. It's there. It's the law. It's
Yeah.
the law.
I'm going to flip Jody's kind of question on its head a little bit in terms of thinking about this, because, like in prepping for your talk and thinking about all of this over the past couple months, I was kind of stunned that, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in 2005, or, really kind of issued a really strong endorsement of exactly what you just said. And it does seem that has tended to be the historical perspective to some extent. And I'm not a religious scholar by any stretch, but or at least in this case, studying this part of the Constitution. So I wonder, is the challenge to this, right, to that question, is that a more of a recent thing, or is this an ongoing struggle that we really see, about religion and government throughout American history?
Right. It is an ongoing struggle. Like, I mean, Angela Davis said it best. She said, freedom is a constant struggle. And
Yeah.
so from its inception, I mean, you have to think the first enslaved Africans came in 1619, right? And I have to give it context like that. The first enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia in 1619. But these enslaved Africans, they came here with their own religions, their own cultures, their own practices. They had their African traditions that some of them, they were 30% of them identified as Muslims. So when you steal people from their land and bring them to a whole different place in which they're not familiar, not to mention you put people from different tribes and different countries together that may not have spoken the same language. So there was even the complication of them trying to be able to communicate with each other. When you bring them to a country and then you say that we want to fight for religious freedom, and yet you haven't fought for human freedom. And within that fight for religious freedom, even if you didn't consider their human freedom, you still didn't allow for them to practice religious freedom. Mm-hmm. So it's been an issue throughout American history. And people sometimes may say, oh, I'm surprised by it. Don't be. This is in the DNA of the country. Like, and I hate to be so blunt about it, but again, when you go back to when the founding framers can sit in a room, can convene from May to September. That's a long time. I mean, that's like quarantine in some ways. Can sit in a room for such a long period of time and not really think about the implications beyond seeing people as property, and to not think beyond, like, what does it mean long term if we set up a system of government that excludes women? And I say that because also that in throughout history, so women have been the backbone of civilization. Like, we move things forward in many different ways, not to discount men, but women move things forward, and we've been the backbone of civilization. But what does it say in terms of what we saw, even the perceptions of certain women, whether it's in religious spaces or non-religious spaces, how certain women don't want to see women in leadership? Then you have a system that has been set up and steeped in patriarchy, and one idea possibly of what religion should look like, although we know that the United States was not established as a Christian nation, but what people have perceived it to be over time. So this has been an ongoing issue, and I hate to say it will continue to be that way until all the hearts and minds and attitudes are changed about who has the right to be, who has the right to exist, who has the right to govern, who has the right to, and without making one feel like they have to profess a certain type of identity. And that's a problem when that occurs. Yeah. I don't want to say anymore because I might get more political.
So, I would just kind of add on to that it seems to me that having that capacity as a nation really is sort of reflects a comfort and a confidence with the actual structures that uphold that society, right? Mm-hmm. Because it is really sort of fear of the other. It is fear of the unknown that sort of leads us in so many ways into that. And so it almost seems paradoxical, right? That if the country is as strong as we would sort of want it to be or sort of imagine it to be, there should be this opening for space, mm-hmm. right? And if you're not allowing that, then what does it say?
Right. Mm-hmm.
You know?
Now
go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that's really a big issue. You know, this past week, actually, for the National Advocacy Summit, I organized a program that was about dismantling white privilege, looking at race, religious freedom, and Christian nationalism. And on that panel, I actually had Amanda Tyler, who's with the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, but also Dr. Corey D.B. Walker and Robbie Jones, who wrote the book, and because I saw someone ask the question about resources, yeah. Robbie Jones wrote the book White Too Long, which talks about how like white supremacy is embedded in Christian nationalism as well as a strong Christian identity in this country. And so it's a good book to read, but also on that panel was Dr. Kiyati Joshi, who is a professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University. And she wrote the book, White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. And so in her book, she talks about how as she identifies as a Hindu woman who wrote this book through her lens and experience that shows that the Christian identity is so deeply embedded in the culture and the laws and the practice, the cultural norms that we don't even think about. For example, like the Blue Sunday, right? Like Blue Sunday, where they close? Yeah. So like, so it's like those things that she talked about in the book, and how, everyone, even if someone now identifies as non-religious or unaffiliated, that in some ways they still benefit from the system of that is shaped around this whole idea of white Christian privilege in America. So that is a book that I would recommend. I would certainly recommend Kiyati Joshi's book. I would recommend Robbie Jones, his book. He's the president, he's the CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute that I talked about. And the last book that I would recommend, there are two more I want to recommend. Tisa Winger's book, Religious Freedom, The Contested History of an American Ideal. She wrote about the history of religious freedom in this country based on the experiences of of Blacks in America. And so I showed that image earlier on about the Moorish Science Temple. And there's a whole section in that book that talks about how the Moorish Science Temple tried to use the same guidelines to establish themselves as a religious group in the United States. And it was like, mm-mm. And so it depends on, again, who you are that determines what you have access to and what you're able to do. And then the last book I would recommend is Faith in American Public Life, written by Melissa Rogers. It is an excellent book if you want to know from a constitutional legal perspective this conversation without it being too legal. I read that book, and it was a great resource for me to engage deeply. And one of the things I appreciated about Melissa's book towards the end is that she incorporated the Negro National Anthem and the hope that was in that song, and how that hope could still resonate in America if we are committed to doing the work. And so, and if we're committed to, as I said earlier, and that Congressman Lewis has always said, if we're committed to being and to getting involved in good trouble. So those are my recommendations for resources. And then also you can visit the AU website, because there are lots of blogs if you're not a book person. There are articles that you can read as well.
Well, I will, get an email out to you, and we'll collect these, and we'll post some additional reading or Sabrina's recommended readings or something like that to our website. And, if any of you need those before we get to it, certainly feel free to email Jody or I, and we'll be happy to sort of convey the information along. Because that's a big stack of books right there.
Yeah, it is. It is.
It is 8:30, and I think that's a high note. If anybody has one last question, ask it now. And if not, I think we will wrap it up. And, I will encourage you all to follow Sabrina and to check out the Americans United website. It is incredibly informative. And we'll be posting this talk to our YouTube channel, and we'll have links to it on our website. So, please refer it to friends, and check out the Byrd Center website. We have a lot of additional amazing material. We've been running a series of talks over the summer about the struggle for civil rights and Black freedom in particular, as it pertains to Congress. And so there's a tremendous amount of really relevant material, historical stories that very much inform today. So please do check out byrdcenter.org. And I hope to see you all soon. And for those of you who are new to the Byrd Center programs, thanks so much. This has been great.
Okay. Yes, thank you.